It started as one of those quiet suburban mornings that felt too calm to ever turn ugly. The kind where the air is still, lawns are freshly cut, and the neighborhood looks exactly like the brochure that sold everyone the dream of peace, order, and safety. I had lived in this HOA-controlled community long enough to know that appearances mattered more than reality here. Clean sidewalks, matching mailboxes, approved paint colors. Everything curated, everything controlled. I was on my porch that morning, going through a normal routine, not expecting anything unusual. The HOA had been increasingly aggressive over the past few months, but nothing that crossed into outright danger. Notices, inspections, passive-aggressive emails, and vague warnings about community compliance. That was their usual playbook. What I didn't know yet was that they had decided to escalate in a way that would shatter every boundary of legality and common sense. The first sign something was wrong wasn't a knock. It was the sound of multiple heavy footsteps on my lawn. Not hurried, not cautious, but deliberate, coordinated. I looked up and saw several men wearing black tactical-style clothing with HOA security printed across their chests. That alone felt strange. The HOA had never had a visible security presence before, let alone one that looked like it had been pulled straight out of a low-budget paramilitary fantasy. Then I noticed the weapons. They weren't concealed. They weren't holstered discreetly. They were displayed openly, pointed downward but unmistakably ready. Rifles, sidearms, the kind of firepower that had no place in a suburban homeowners association, no matter how inflated their sense of authority had become. My porch, my lawn, my private property had suddenly turned into something that felt more like a hostile checkpoint. This wasn't enforcement. This wasn't compliance. This was intimidation. The men spread out across my yard without asking permission, positioning themselves in ways that blocked exits and controlled space. Their posture made it clear they expected obedience, not questions. The HOA president, a woman named Marla Voss, stood back near the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching like a director overseeing a scene she believed was already under her control. They claimed they were there for a safety audit. That phrase alone was insulting. There was nothing safe about 5 armed men showing up unannounced at a private residence. There was nothing routine about demanding access to someone's home under the threat of force. And there was absolutely nothing legal about what they were attempting to do. I stayed calm. Years of discipline had trained that into me long before I ever moved into this neighborhood. Panic is what aggressors feed on, and I wasn't about to give them that satisfaction. Instead, I observed the way they held their weapons, the way they scanned the area, the way they tried to project authority without actually having any. It was obvious they believed they had power simply because no one had challenged them before. They referenced vague HOA bylaws, misquoted state statutes, and leaned heavily on the idea that community rules somehow overrode constitutional rights. According to them, the HOA had the authority to verify safe storage of firearms within the community. That verification, they claimed, required access to my gun vault. Not just visual confirmation, not just paperwork. They wanted the code. That demand crossed a line so severe it couldn't be misunderstood as ignorance. It was coercion, plain and simple. The moment they escalated to that demand, the situation shifted from an HOA dispute into something far more serious. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about control, about seeing how far they could push someone they assumed would fold under pressure. What they didn't know was that pressure had never been a stranger to me. I had served years earlier in environments where mistakes got people hurt or worse. I understood weapons. I understood intimidation tactics. And I understood the difference between legitimate authority and people playing dress-up with borrowed power. These men weren't law enforcement. They weren't military. They were private individuals acting under the banner of an HOA that had grossly overestimated its reach. I noticed cameras then. One of them was wearing a body cam, probably to create a narrative in their favor. What they didn't realize was that I had my own recording equipment already running. Every step they took onto my property, every posture shift, every implied threat was being documented. Marla Voss watched silently, clearly confident that this show of force would end with compliance. Her expression wasn't concerned. It was satisfied. This wasn't about safety. This was about dominance. About sending a message to the rest of the neighborhood that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. Neighbors had begun to peek through windows by now. Curtains shifted. Doors cracked open slightly. No one intervened. Fear does that. HOAs thrive on it. The men continued to tighten their formation, subtly but intentionally. Their presence alone made it clear they expected me to surrender my rights without resistance, to hand over access to my property, my belongings, and my privacy simply because they demanded it. That was the moment I realized this wasn't an isolated incident. This had been planned. They had uniforms, weapons, a script, a justification ready to go. Someone had authorized this. Someone had believed it would work. And if it worked on me, it would work on anyone else in the community who didn't know better or didn't feel confident enough to say no. The situation hung there, tense and dangerous, balanced on the edge of a decision that would determine how far this would go. They were waiting for me to comply, to flinch, to give them exactly what they wanted so they could walk away feeling validated in their abuse of power. Instead, I stood my ground, not aggressively, not emotionally, just firmly, because I knew something they didn't. This wasn't going to end the way they expected. And as the safety audit dragged on, their confidence began to crack, just slightly, as they realized they weren't dealing with the kind of homeowner they had rehearsed for. That realization would change everything in the chapters that followed. The longer the armed HOA security team remained on my property, the more their operation began to unravel. What they had expected to be a quick show of force followed by immediate compliance was turning into an uncomfortable standoff that attracted attention they clearly hadn't planned for. The confidence they had arrived with was slowly being replaced by uncertainty, and that shift was subtle but unmistakable. They had come prepared for fear, not resistance. As minutes passed, their formation became less precise. One man adjusted his stance repeatedly. Another scanned the neighboring houses with growing unease. The weapons that had initially been displayed as symbols of authority now felt like liabilities, heavy reminders that they were crossing legal lines in full view of witnesses and cameras. Marla Voss attempted to maintain control from the sidewalk, but her presence was beginning to look less commanding and more reckless. This was no longer a private HOA matter. Neighbors were gathering at a distance, phones raised, curiosity overpowering fear. The narrative was slipping out of her hands, and she knew it. What stood out most was how often they referenced authority without actually possessing it. They leaned on vague claims of community approval, emergency powers, and imagined bylaws that supposedly justified their actions. But none of that mattered. An HOA does not get to suspend constitutional rights. It does not get to demand access to private property at gunpoint. And it certainly does not get to run armed audits like a rogue militia. The longer this went on, the clearer it became that they had never expected scrutiny. They were used to compliance, used to homeowners apologizing, backing down, signing forms just to make the problem go away. They had built their strategy around intimidation because intimidation had always worked before. But intimidation collapses when it meets someone who recognizes it for what it is. I remained everything. The calm response wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Panic escalates situations. Calm exposes incompetence. And the more controlled I appeared, the more exposed they became. At some point, one of the men stepped slightly out of position, clearly uncomfortable. His grip on his weapon tightened, not with aggression, but with uncertainty. That detail mattered. It revealed that even among them, not everyone believed in what they were doing. Some were following orders without understanding the consequences. Those consequences were already stacking up. What they failed to understand was that every second they remained on my property, armed and uninvited, increased their liability. Trespass, coercion, brandishing, civil rights violations. The list wasn't theoretical. It was growing in real time, and it was all being captured on camera. Marla attempted to reframe the situation, presenting it as cooperation rather than enforcement, but the damage was already done. Once weapons enter a situation, intent is assumed. No amount of rebranding can turn an armed demand into a friendly request. The power dynamic had flipped. They were no longer controlling the situation. They were trapped in it. What really unsettled them was the realization that I wasn't isolated. I wasn't frantic. I wasn't reacting the way they expected. There was no raised voice, no pleading, no visible fear. That kind of composure under pressure tends to alarm people who rely on dominance to feel secure. And then came the moment they truly didn't expect. I calmly referenced legal boundaries. Not aggressively, not threateningly, just factually. It was enough to make them hesitate. Because facts are dangerous to people who operate on bluff and authority theater. They could posture all they wanted, but they knew they weren't law enforcement. They knew they had no warrant. They knew this was spiraling beyond HOA politics into criminal exposure. That hesitation spread through the group like a crack in glass. One of them looked toward Marla for direction. Another subtly repositioned his weapon, no longer aimed downward with confidence, but held in a way that suggested uncertainty. These were small changes, but they told a big story. The people who arrived, believing they held all the power, were beginning to realize how fragile that power actually was. Marla's frustration became evident. Her plan was failing, and failure in front of witnesses is the one thing people like her cannot tolerate. This wasn't about safety. It never had been. It was about proving that the HOA could still dominate homeowners who dared to resist. But dominance without legitimacy is just intimidation, and intimidation collapses under documentation. As the standoff dragged on, something else became clear. They didn't know who they were dealing with. They had assumed I was just another resident who owned firearms. They had not done their homework. They had not considered experience, training, or the psychological reality of confronting someone who understands both weapons and authority structures far better than they do. That ignorance was their biggest mistake, because what they thought was a display of force was actually a display of vulnerability. Every misstep, every unlawful demand, every second of armed presence was building a case against them that would be impossible to walk back. At this point, retreat would have been the smartest move. But people who build their identity around control rarely choose wisdom over ego. Instead, they doubled down. They reiterated their demands. They leaned harder into their fabricated authority. And in doing so, they crossed a threshold from questionable behavior into undeniable misconduct. That was when it became obvious this story would not end on my porch. It would end in courtrooms, board meetings, resignations, and consequences far beyond what any of them had imagined when they first stepped onto my lawn with weapons and arrogance. They had come, expecting submission. What they were about to face was accountability, and they still had no idea who they were testing. What began as an attempted display of authority ended as a slow, irreversible unraveling. The armed HOA security team eventually withdrew from my property, not in victory, but in quiet retreat. There were no declarations, no resolutions, no admissions of wrongdoing in that moment. Just the unmistakable realization that they had stepped into territory they could not control and could not erase. But their departure did not end the incident. It marked the beginning of consequences. Within hours, the footage of the encounter began circulating beyond the neighborhood. What the HOA believed would remain contained quickly reached legal professionals, civil rights advocates, and local authorities who understood exactly how serious the situation had been. The visual evidence spoke louder than any statement ever could. Armed civilians, operating under the banner of a homeowners association, demanding access to a private residence. No warrant, no law enforcement authority, no justification that could survive scrutiny. The illusion of power the HOA had relied on for years shattered almost immediately. Neighbors who had once stayed silent began to come forward. Some shared stories of intimidation that never escalated to this level but followed the same pattern. Others admitted they had complied with unreasonable demands simply to avoid conflict. Fear had kept the community obedient, but fear also created resentment, and resentment turns into action when someone finally draws a line. That line had been drawn publicly. Legal reviews of the HOA's bylaws exposed what many had suspected all along. There was no authority for armed enforcement, no legal framework for firearm inspections, and no justification for the actions taken that day. The so-called safety audit was revealed for what it truly was, an abuse of power dressed up as policy. The people involved attempted damage control. Statements were issued. Language was softened. Responsibility was deflected. But none of it mattered. Once constitutional violations are documented, intent becomes irrelevant. The law does not care how noble someone claims their motivation was when the methods themselves are illegal. The HOA board fractured under pressure. Members began distancing themselves from Marla Voss and the decision to authorize the armed operation. Emergency meetings were held behind closed doors. Resignations followed. The community that once prided itself on order was now scrambling to contain fallout that had become impossible to hide. The security team dissolved almost overnight. Contractors cut ties. Insurance providers withdrew coverage. Liability became a word no one wanted attached to their name. What had once been framed as protection now looked exactly like what it was, a reckless gamble that endangered residents and exposed everyone involved to severe legal risk. The irony was unavoidable. In their attempt to control one homeowner, the HOA lost control of everything. For me, the outcome was never about revenge or dominance. It was about precedent, about ensuring that what happened on my lawn could not quietly happen on someone else's who lacked the experience or confidence to push back. The law exists to prevent exactly this kind of escalation, and once triggered, it does not stop simply because an HOA regrets its choices. The veteran angle that had initially been irrelevant to them became central to understanding their mistake, not because of aggression or threat, but because experience brings clarity. Training teaches restraint, awareness, and respect for lawful authority. Everything the HOA had pretended to possess, they lacked. Everything they ignored, I recognized immediately. That difference changed the outcome. The community itself began to heal in the aftermath. Rules were revised. Oversight was demanded. Residents who once feared retaliation now spoke openly at meetings. The myth of unquestionable HOA power was gone, replaced by an understanding that authority, without legality, is nothing more than intimidation waiting to be challenged. Marla Voss disappeared from leadership entirely. Her name became synonymous with overreach. What she once wielded confidently had turned into a cautionary tale whispered whenever new board members discussed enforcement or compliance. As for the armed visit, it became a permanent reminder that power must always answer to the law. No uniform, no title, no self-appointed role grants the right to threaten, coerce, or violate fundamental rights. The porch where it all began returned to being just that, a porch. Quiet, ordinary, safe again. But the lesson remained. HOAs exist to manage communities, not rule them. When they forget that distinction, they invite consequences that cannot be undone. They came expecting obedience. They left facing accountability. And they learned, far too late, that some lines cannot be crossed without everything collapsing behind you.